Patrick comes up to me and says, "Gee, would you like to speak for the sons again?" And I said, "Well, sure." And then he said, "What I really think you should talk about," he tends to suggest topics. And he says, "One of the things that, that they, meaning you, are wondering about is how, this picture of an angry Jehovah in the Old Testament, how that matches the idea of a loving God that we like to talk about, how these things work out, and, is all this issue." And he said, he told me that that's what you're concerned about. Well, it just so happens that I recently did a presentation to the regional clergy meeting on a similar topic, where I was looking at what I would call loosely the doctrine of punishment, which has some interesting things going on. There's things we know from heaven and hell about punishment in the other world, and there's examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it makes kind of an interesting story to go through this and look at it, and not from the point of view of the fact that we're going to be prison guards, but just from the idea of, as parents, as people in responsibility, what principles can we come up with from what the writings say about punishment that might apply in our activities in our lives? So that's where I went with this, and it's because Patrick says you wanted to hear it. So here we are. Here's the overview for today. We'll start out with, let me get that cursor out of the way. We'll start out with some examples from the Old Testament. Why did you do that? Sorry. F4, F5. Start from the first slide. Let's go. This is ridiculous. I don't have technical problems. There we go. There we go. I'll put the cursor up there. Sorry about that. So, we'll talk about some examples from the Old Testament, some kinds of punishment in the spiritual world, who does the punishing, and why punishment, when done according to spiritual principles, is actually mercy. And that's kind of an important point. So, here we go. I'm going to give an introduction, a couple of readings first. This one comes from the Arcana Celestia 6997, subsection 2, where it says, "The word attributes anger to Jehovah, or the Lord, because of the very general truth that all things come from God." If everything comes from God, then everything, including evil and anger, comes from God. So thus, the bad as well as the good. But this very general truth, which young children, older ones, and simple people need to have, must at a later stage be clarified. That is to say, it must be shown that bad things are assignable to man, though they may seem to be assignable to God, and have been declared to be so to the end that people may learn to fear God, so as not to be destroyed by wicked things they themselves do, and may then come to love Him. Fear must come before love, in order that love may have holy fear within it. Let me just stop and mention the way this idea of holy fear. It seems, why would you be afraid of God? And it's not that kind of fear. I use the example when I think about what holy fear means is, think about that day that you were handed your firstborn child. And this infant is an hour old or less. And you're holding this child in your hands, and the head's in your hand, and everything else is in your other hand. And you're looking at that child, and you feel a fear that you could drop it, or, "Hello, son, I'm going to disappoint you at some point." The reactions you have, that you have this a fear that comes from love, the fear that you might harm it, that somehow by your behavior you could cause harm to this innocent thing. To me, that's a picture of what holy fear is. And so the idea is, here's this illustration here in this passage, talks about how when you start out, you need to have a sense that, oh my gosh, my dad's going to kill me. You know, there's a necessary fear in children so that they're afraid to do things because that gives them an external structure. And then it says, as you get older and come into self-control and into maturity, then you govern yourself and you do things from love. But it's a process. That's what's going on here. So a lot of what we're seeing in the Old Testament is that it's written for the children of Israel. And their states, the states of the children of Israel, are actually very childlike. And so a lot of the stuff that happens in that part of the word is written for childish states. Moving ahead to section 3, furthermore, it was by means of punishments that the Israelites and the Jews were compelled to fulfill the external and formal requirements of religious laws and commands. This led them to think that Jehovah was angry and punished them, when in fact they themselves, through their idolatrous behavior, were the ones who brought such things on themselves and cut themselves off from heaven. Now, one of the things we need to remember about the way the word was written, it was written according to appearances. Human beings wrote those words. And a lot of the stuff that was happening was based on how they understood it was happening. And, you know, when various things happen, it really looks like Jehovah's angry if you don't know what's going on the internal sense. And we know that these particular people, where they fit in the history, was they were so external that they had to be compelled to do the external forms of worship that represented things that the angels could worship from. So they actually had to be driven to it. They had they didn't have any internal sense of it all, what was going on. I mean, if you think about it, what their worship was. Imagine the children of Israel, you're one of the children of Israel, you're out there in the desert, there's the tabernacle over there, there's a pillar of fire by night, there's a pillar of cloud by day. Jehovah's visibly present right with you. And what are you required to do? What is your worship requirement? You have to follow some rules. And basically, you bring food to feed the priests. You bring sacrifices. That was all they were required to do. There was no sermons. There was no baptism. There was nothing. Basically, there was this thing, and you brought certain, different things would happen, and you bring a turtle dove or a lamb or a whatever. It would be sacrificed. The blood would be burned. The smoke would go up. And the fat would be collected because that was special. The blood and the fat were special. But basically, the meat went into a big pot. At the end of the day, the priests would come out with their flesh hook, which was part of the tabernacle furniture, and they would be permitted to take a swipe and draw out whatever they had that had been cooking all day, and that was what they took home tonight for their family. So that was church for them. And it was these very external structure. So from their point of view, what's going on, you get things like the flood. This idea of this terrible disaster where everybody gets wiped out. The first 10 and a half books of Genesis, right up to the point where, what's Abraham's father's name? Eber, thank you very much. He is the first historical person who actually was a historical person of the word. Everything up to that is a made-up story, and actually the writings call it factitious. It's not fiction, it's based on fact. So that's a difficult term sometimes, but when I teach the grade 3 and 4, I often ask them, this idea of a made-up story that's true. How can you make up a story that's true if it's made up? And I said, well, okay, here's an exercise. Think of some true idea that you want to illustrate, like don't be a bully. Now, or something like telling a lie leads to more lies and leads to trouble. It says, now make up some people, have them talk to each other, and illustrate it. Now you've made up the story. The situation, the people, everything's made up, but you're illustrating a truth. And that's what the 10 and a half chapters, the story of the creation story. Right away, let me back up. There's not one creation story. There's two. They follow one after the other. You have the 7 days of creation, and then bang, right after it, there's a completely different creation story about the Garden of Eden. you ever notice? It's not a continuation. It's actually two different creation stories, one after the other. There's some very funny things going on in there because it's there to contain, the words that were selected were there to contain the internal sense. So that's important. So, the ancient word, 10 and a half chapters of which we have, was made up stories that illustrate divine truths. And the rest of the word uses the record of real events. So, when we talk about Abraham, now here's a guy who lived roughly 120 years. And the way the word's written is kind of interesting because we don't record everything that happened. But what happens is certain events in his life were selected because they carried a correspondence or a meaning that could be used. So when you look at these events, what happened? There was lots of other things that were happening. But the word was written in such a way that the Lord guided the hand of the prophets who were writing these things down so that only some things were recorded, and they were recorded in a certain way, based on real people doing real things, but at the same time in a selective way so that it carried a message. So it's edited. Noah's Ark, part of the made-up story, it's a picture of the human mind. If you think about read the descriptions of it, it's got 3 decks, and they represent the natural and the spiritual and the celestial. It's got 1 window. If I was building a boat to house 10,000 animals, I would make more than 1 window. Yeah, but it's got 1 window, and that represents the way at the highest level, our mind is open to influx from the divine, where the light comes in from heaven. The animals represent all the different loves and affections that we have. So here you have this picture of the Lord saying, there's this terrible storm coming of all kinds of evils, and we're going to take the human mind, and we're going to create it in such a way that it can survive the storm. That it can survive the storm. And people who don't do these things will be taken away, but those who have these things make these choices, can survive the flood. And by golly, we have, people talk about, well, my life's in chaos right now. It's like I'm in a storm. We're having floods every day, right now, and the Lord's leading us through and keeping us afloat because our mind is like an ark. And it's not just, some historic thing in the background. We're not worried about it that way. It's an illustration of the kind of thing that we all experience all the time. Here's another picture. That's pretty dramatic. Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's down there. His nephew's been taken. He's living down in there. And they discover it's just this incredibly evil place. And God says to Abraham, I love this story, this argument. God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, but wait, what if there's some good people there? What if there's 100 good people there? And this bargaining, it's like, going to the market, this whole idea of bargaining with God. Okay, God says, well, if we can find 100 good people, I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And they said, well, pardon me for arguing with you, but what about 50? And he works it down to 10. And finally he says, God said, oh, all right. Do you think this is written from people, from their perspective of how things work? The reality's there. And Abraham finally says, how about 10? And God relents and says, okay, well, if there's only 10 people, 10 good people, I'll save it. Now, that's an important lesson. When we think about our own lives, and we think about, in the New Testament, we've got the parable of the wheat and tares. Again, here you have this field, and it's got a couple bad things in it. Do you destroy the good to remove the bad? Same thing with Sodom and Gomorrah. If there was some good in it, we wouldn't destroy it. All it took was 10 good people in that whole city, and we wouldn't destroy it. But he couldn't find even 10. He had just found it was just Lot and his family. So they left town, and you have this destruction. It sort of explains why he hasn't wiped us all out, because he still finds some good in us. Here's another classic story. Notice the illustrations here. You've got several interesting things. You've got these guys. You know what they're doing? Can anybody tell me? They're recovering from being circumcised as adults, yes. And then over here you have Simeon and Levi. What do they do? You notice this? That's not a curtain. They're busy killing people. That's blood. And this is Dinah and Shechem. I don't think it was actually a medieval castle. It was more that. Briefly, I love these old illustrations for things. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, they come into the country, and she's been hanging out with this group, and suddenly she finds she's a young woman. And she runs into a place where they've got other young women to talk to. She goes off, she visits the town of Shechem. The prince's name is the same as the city because he's the leader of the thing. And she meets this young man, and we don't know the exact circumstances of whether it was, something aggressive and bad or whether she actually seduced him or what happened. Anyhow, she ends up sleeping with Shechem without benefit of marriage. Well, this is a horrible scandal. So they come back, and Abraham negotiates, it's Jacob, negotiates with the people of Shechem and says, all right, what we'll do is we'll let them marry, and then we'll form a relationship. But because we have this important religion that's very important to us, you all have to get circumcised. So they said, well, okay, they can see an advantage. Apparently, Jacob is this very wealthy potentate, oriental potentate, traveling to the land with all his sheep and cattle and so forth. He's very wealthy, and he's got a lot of people, and, if a small town could be threatened by him. So, okay, we're going to do this. So they all get circumcised. And Simeon and Levi wait until they're there, and then they go in and murder everybody while they're recovering from their operations, when they can't defend themselves. They spoil the city, take Dinah back, and in all this, we never hear anything about what Dinah wishes. We never hear about her again. But basically, no, you can't be with them. Later, Jacob condemns his sons. When they go through the thing, Reuben was the firstborn, and he didn't get the blessing. He didn't get the blessing of the firstborn because later in the story we find out he goes into his father's concubine. Reuben and Simeon and Levi get kicked out of the prophecy because they did this murder to Shechem. And that's why Judah gets the blessing of the firstborn, although he's the fourth. So this is why Simeon and Levi get kicked out of the process. But the important thing about this story is the people of Shechem represent people from the ancient church. These people were good people. And the idea of them being conjoined with the Jews, who were so blatantly external, was a bad idea. And so it says the Lord allowed this to happen, allowed Simeon and Levi to kill them all, because it was better for their spiritual lives to be dead and go to heaven than be associated with the Jews. That's the internal sense of what that means, that this idea of these people were so external and the people of the ancient church were more elevated, and it was a mixture that couldn't be permitted. And so they were allowed to be killed that way. So there's an example of a story where this terrible murder takes place, an entire town's wiped out in a rather unorthodox and sneaky way. It's murderous, and yet it's permitted for an important spiritual reason. Again, is God angry? No, he's being merciful in this by allowing people to do these things. The other thing that's interesting about this is when Jacob finds out that his sons have just murdered an entire town, he admonishes them not for murder, but for doing something that says, you've made my name to be dirt in the country. And think about that. Think about the idea. He is basically a traveling merchant. Do they have contracts? Do they have computers? Do they have paperwork? No. The way people do business in this life, in this kind of life, is by your word. Your word is your bond. And now Jacob has made an agreement with these people, and it's been broken. And he's worried that he's not going to be able to make contracts with other people, that people won't trust him. That's what he's mad about. What does that tell you about these people? That he's not mad about the murder. He's mad about not being able to do business. Here's another thing from the Arcana. After the truth and good of the church, which are represented by Simeon and Levi, were wiped out, and falsity and evil took their place, further falsities and evils were added, which are meant in the contrary sense by the rest of Jacob's sons. So again, you have this idea that when you talk about correspondences, frequently it can be flipped over. So Simeon and Levi, which normally would represent something good, because they're in this particular state in this story, they represent the wickedness that's taken over. These general aspects of faith and charity, which those sons represented, become falsities and evils of that kind once the truth and good of the church have been wiped out. And those further falsities and evils have been added to them. For falsities and evils are constantly on the increase within the church, once it has been perverted and wiped out. There we go. It is these added falsities and evils that are meant by the references to Jacob's sons, coming upon the slain and plundering the city after Simeon and Levi have killed every male in the city, as well as Hamor and Shechem, and taken Dinah and gone away. Bubba, question?
Yeah. Weren't the sons of Levi sort of the appointed priesthood for
Yep.
the entire...
That comes later. But yes, that's right. That here, Levi, the Levites, are established later on as the priesthood. And yet they come from a guy who's a murderer. Yeah. Interesting stories. So we come by here, it's talking about the way they not only do they spoil the city, which means they take all these things. And in this case, the flocks and the herds represent natural and rational good. The donkeys or asses represent truth derived from natural and rational good. Generally, anything that has to, like a horse, genus equus, represents things that have to do with faith or understanding the word. So the asses represents truth derived from natural and rational good. All the things in the city, a city generally represents a doctrine. So truth and good of the church. Wealth, having a wealth of knowledge, factual knowledge. The taking the children means to take away the innocence. So these are all things, when you see these stories, oh, these terrible things are happening, they killed all the women and children. It's because what's happening is that in that state, you're killing your innocence. Women or charity, you're taking that away. Taking captive and plunder means seized and perverted. So everything in the house, everything in the church. So that's what's happening on the internal sense. That's why these things are permitted. And also we would say that Hamor and Shechem are the people. They're a remnant of the ancient church, as I said before. I'll go through this quickly. Jacob and his sons are Hebrews, and they're so external as to be a representative of a church. They're not even actually a church. And so if the people of Shechem had been conjoined to the Hebrews by the marriage of Dinah and Hamor, it would have meant their spiritual destruction. By the way, Prince Shechem and Hamor are the same person. And it was better for them to die than be conjoined. Here's another wonderful story. Achan steals something, a wedge of gold and a Babylonian garment. And what happens? Not only is he destroyed, but his family and his livestock, and they're put in a pit and stoned. Everything that has to do with his family for a couple of generations. Wonderful story from the Old Testament. We love to teach the children. But the point is, it's really simple. If you want to get rid of an evil, like Achan, you have to get rid of all of it. And the animals here represent the livestock are the affections that come from doing an evil. If you do something that's bad and it's fun, then the livestock represents those affections you get from doing that evil thing. And the children and the wives, again, represent all those different characteristics that come. So here's an illustration. Let's say you're having a problem with theft. You like to steal things, and it's causing you problems in your life, as it would probably do. And so you decide, I need to stop stealing. So I'm going to stop stealing. But it's so much fun. So what I'll do is I'll stop stealing on every day but Saturday. Saturdays I can still do it. In other words, if you try and get rid of an evil, but try and keep the delight of it, that's not going to work. So killing Achan is getting rid of the evil, but you also have to restrain yourself in such a way that all the affections and delights and frogs that follow from it are also destroyed. So that's what this is about, being stones. Stones represent truth. The truth from the Word is destroying the things that are false and wrong in your life after you decide to get rid of the evil. You're shunning an evil. You've identified, you've done your research, you've looked at yourself, you've prayed to the Lord for help, and you find that you have Achan in you. And you say, I want to get rid of him. And you get rid of him and all the things that go with him. So that's what that story is about. Not so bad when you hear it. Here's another one. You have Korah. He and his friends, they staged a rebellion against Moses. And the earth actually opens up and swallows them. Look at this. I think people are falling in. Again, when you have that problem, whatever the evil represents, and of course all these different people represent different evils, and you get into the detail of it if you want. Easy to do that. What we're seeing here is that when an evil is removed, you have to remove the whole thing. You have to really stop. This one sort of takes the cake. This is at the end of Judges. Again, here's a story, and you can see what's happening here. Here's a donkey. This is the first part of it. You see this poor woman? She's being chopped in pieces, as you can see. There's her head, there's her legs and arms and guts falling out. It's all very exciting. This is the story at the end of Judges, Judges 19 and 20, 21. Very strange story. I'm going to summarize it for you. Basically, the story goes that a Levite was traveling with his concubine. Frequently, priests and prophets were told by the Lord to take a woman as a concubine but not marry her. And you wonder, what in the world's going on? Well, the priest represents a truth, and the wife or concubine represents a related good. And what it's telling you, if he's taking a concubine, it means it's not joined together yet the way a wife would be. So what happens, you have this truth, the Levite, and some good that's coming from it, but it's still flawed. It's not quite conjoined. That's why you have a priest and a concubine rather than a wife. So he's traveling, and this is sort of at the end of the book of Judges. You come to the point where the children of Israel have been in the land for a while, and all the idealism that came in when Joshua was leading them has sort of gone away. And there's a lot of infighting and civil wars going on in the north and the south and whatever. And the whole nature of the country has gotten pretty external. So we have this Levite, and he's traveling in the country, and when night comes, he gets near Jebus, which at this point is before David has conquered it. It's actually going to be the city of Jerusalem at some point. And he didn't want to stay there. He's an honorable man. He doesn't want to stay there because it's a Gentile city. You know, he wants to be somewhere with his own kind because that could be a dangerous place. So instead, he continues on into the area of Benjamin to a place called Gibeah. And he comes into town, and they're about to sort of settle down in the public square. And this man comes out using the Middle Eastern custom of being a host. He says, no, you can't sleep there. That's dangerous. Come to my house. So he invites the Levite into his home with his concubine by the law of hospitality. It says that during the night, perverted men come and bang on the door and demand that the Levite be given out to them. They want to do homosexual things to him. And they think, oh no, this can't be done. So the host opens the door and offers them his virgin daughter instead because it would be less disorderly. Here, take my daughter. There's a crowd out there. Just take my daughter. They don't want her. So she comes back in, and the Levite puts his concubine out. And what happens is she is abused through the night, and in the morning they open the door, and she's on the doorstep, and she's dead. And this is a terrible shock that this should happen in a city of Israel. And so what happens is that, the idea that he came to this town because he thought it would be a church town, it would be a safe place to be, where people would follow Jehovah, where people knew the rules. And this terrible, perverted murder takes place in a town of Benjamin, in the heart of the country. And so he takes her, and that's the picture. He chops her into 12 pieces and sends one piece to each of the to the leader of each of the tribes, and says, "Look what's happened in Israel." And this was a fairly dramatic message to get. You get this chunk of a woman, and with the message that these bad things had happened in Benjamin. Well, of course, as you would hope, the people, as the story of the company, as you would hope, these people have become enraged. Wow, how can this be happening in our country? How can this be something that we can do? We can't tolerate this. They're all triggered. They're ready to do something. So they come together, and they decide that they're going to go, the 11 tribes are going to come together and form an army, and they're going to go punish Benjamin. Well, through the prophets, the Lord says, no, I don't want you all to go. I need you to cast lots to find out which tribe is going to fight. So they cast lots, and they find out that Judah has been selected. So Judah says, all right, here we go. The Lord has chosen us to fight. Our cause is just. Here we go. And they go off, and they fight against the men of Benjamin. And the first day out, they lose 18,000 men. They're driven off the field. They go, oops. That wasn't what we expected. And so they do it again the next day. They cast lots, and Judah is chosen again. And they go out against Benjamin, and the next day they lose 22,000 men and are driven off the field. Okay? Can you do the math? What does that add up to? 40 represents, there you go, temptation, right there. So I'm teaching this to fourth graders, and I'm just trying to tell this story, and one of the little fourth graders says, that's so cool. He says, when they send them out on the third day and they win, he says, the little guy says, this is so cool. He says, Judah's love to the Lord. He says, and you got to, if 40 means a temptation. So that means that when you're fighting a temptation, you need to fight it with your love to the Lord. That needs to be what leads. He says, and it's going to be hard. You might not succeed the first time, but if you keep doing it 3 times, which means complete, if you stay with it until it's done, you'll win. So here you have this horrible story with this wonderful meaning that's obvious, which is with a cursory knowledge of the internal sense of representations. That here you have, if you led by love of the Lord, your love of the Lord in trying to do the right thing, you may fail, you may have bad experiences, but if you keep after it and do it until it's finish the job, in the end, it will be all right. So, it's really a wonderful story. And the interesting story is, after they win, they finally go out and they demolish Benjamin. And then they go, oh no, what do we do? We're supposed to have 12 tribes. And we've now destroyed the tribe of Benjamin. They go out to the Gentiles and capture a whole bunch of people to restock Benjamin. Oh, what wonderful stories. Okay, I did this 18 plus. Being temptation, Judah's love to the Lord. Initial failure, victory in the third day. Yeah. There we go. Divine providence. Every person can freely, indeed quite freely, think as he pleases, either in opposition to God or on the side of God, and one who thinks in opposition to God is rarely punished in the natural world because he is always in a state to be reformed there. But he's punished in the spiritual world, which happens after death, because then he can no longer be reformed. So punishments happen. You might not get caught in this world, but when you get to the spiritual world, it will be there. The wars described in the Word are those which the children of Israel waged against various nations, such as the Amorites, Ammonites, Moabites, Philistines, Syrians, Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. And when the children of Israel, who represented the church, turned away from their precepts and statutes and fell into the evils which those nations symbolized, for each nation with whom the children of Israel waged war symbolized a particular kind of evil, then they were punished by that nation. For instance, when they profaned the sanctities of the church by foul idolatries, they were punished by the Assyrians and Chaldeans, for Assyria and Chaldea symbolized the profanation of the sacred. So the point here is that all these different stories and all these different battles represent all the different things that, every one of us has an inclination to evils of every kind. And as we go through life, we're tempted by different things. Little kids have different temptations than teenagers. Teenagers have different temptations than people who are young adults. And as you go through life, it's like traveling through the land and running into Amorites and Philistines and those things. And every one of those things represents a different evil that we go through. And the idea is that's why God says, and you've got to kill them all. Because when you run into an evil, you have to get rid of it entirely, or it comes back. You look at the stories there, the Lord says, take them out, and what happens is they don't take them out, they don't finish it, they leave some women, they whatever, and down the road you see that they're destroyed by it. If you don't, this is why the Lord gives these apparent commands, and remember it's how they understood it, and they put it into his mouth. Punishments in the spiritual world. Witches or sirens are punished severely. There's so many things about punishment. I'm just going to give a couple. Some in Gehenna, some in a kind of court among snakes. Some are punished by being ripped apart and by various beatings, accompanied by very great pain and torment. In the process of time, they are separated from one another and come to look like skeletons from head to toe. A lot of different talks about how in the spiritual world, the flesh and the organs that represent good things are removed from them. So when they're seen from a distance, they appear like skeletons, which may arise why we have that kind of stuff at Halloween. That people have sort of perceived that this is a thing that's there, those scary parts of the spiritual world. Here's a passage that's important. It says, people who during their lifetime have developed the habit of saying one thing and thinking another, especially those who, beneath a show of friendship, hypocrisy. Here's what the punishment is. People who during their lifetime have developed a habit of saying one thing and thinking another, especially those who beneath a show of friendship have gazed with envy on other people's wealth, wander around and ask wherever they go whether they can stay with those people they meet. They say they are poor, and on being welcomed they gaze enviously from innate desire on all that they see. When it's discovered what they're really like, they are fined and expelled from there. Okay, how can you be fined in the other world? Apparently there's some money. Sometimes they suffer dreadful tearings apart, which vary according to the habit they have developed of deceitful pretense. Some suffer it over the whole body. This is tearing. Others in the feet, others in the loins, others in the breast, others in the head, and others only round the region of the mouth. They are hammered this way, back and forth, in ways defying description. Violent crushings together of parts of body, and so wrenchings apart take place, causing them to believe that they have been torn into bits. Resistance is also added so as to intensify the pain. Such are the punishments that are involved in being torn apart, with many variations, to be repeated again and again at intervals, until a dread and horror of deceiving by lying is ground into them. Each punishment inflicted takes something away. So even in the spiritual world, even in hell, people who, they never leave hell, but they eventually are sort of ground down into a form of external obedience. They hate it, but they realize that the punishment eventually builds to the point where sort of sit there wishing they could do it, but they don't because they're being punished. Here's one that's kind of interesting. This is from the diary. The lot of those who lust after infants and children. And it says, about a kitchen. I didn't want to put this up. I'm just going to read it to you. After I'd gone to bed, suddenly a door to some kitchen was opened to me. And when the door was opening, I felt the heat of the kitchen strike my face and saw some people running around and hard at work, as well as pots and pans around the walls. Then a large fireplace. But these things I saw faintly. Hence it was obvious that this was a kitchen area and the people there were called cooks. When I inquired who in the other life are such as these, I was instructed that these are those who had delighted in the filthiest lust of raping infants and small girls. It is not, and he says in parentheses, it's not permitted to tell these things publicly, lest they enter into people's thought. And just parenthetically, I'll say, it's interesting to note that at some points, when we're doing this, like the story on the grand man, it goes through all the different organs, what the bones represent and the skin represents and the liver and so forth. And when it gets to the organs of generation, it says, I've learned from heaven what these things represent, but I can't tell you, I can't write it down, because even mentioning these subjects cause people to get lascivious thoughts. And so I'm not going to tell you some of the most beautiful and celestial things that there are in the spiritual world, because you're going to think dirty thoughts about it. We are human, after all. Several times little children were shown, some of which had been little children of a half year, 1 year, 3 or to 6 years old. These people are in such a kitchen, and they cook each other in boiling hot water, in which they are tormented most dreadfully. So, just a taste of some of the punishments that you run into when you're reading the diary and some other things, as Swedenborg was taken through these places and saw things going on in the world of spirits, and to an extent some of the higher elements of hell, of what happens to people who are in evil. The question then becomes, who actually punishes, which goes back to, is Jehovah the one who punishes? Did he open up the earth? What actually happened here? Who's the one who actually punishes? The Lord punishes no one. This is from the Arcana. The diabolical crew does it. We often talk about how in the spiritual world is a kingdom of uses. In the spiritual world, people in hell have the use of punishing people who are in evil. They actually punish each other mostly. But at the same time, you think about someone who's not a very good person. It's very difficult for the Lord to flow in and inspire their loves. And he actually allows his influence to come through hell, so the people have some life at all. Even just loving their evil. That's some kind of love and some kind of life that they can have. That's a use that the hells provide. 1838. Taken as example the vastation, the punishment, and the condemnation which are ascribed to the Lord many times in the Word. These are in fact attributable to the members of the church who vastate, punish, and condemn themselves. It also appears to the eyes of the individual as though the Lord vastated, punished, and condemned, and because the appearance is such, it's so expressed according to appearances. For unless a person were taught by means of appearances, he would never allow himself to be taught at all. So, what we're saying here is, yeah, you probably noticed that there's an appearance that Jehovah punishes. And it's an important appearance, like I said at the beginning. The child who says, my dad's going to kill me. When actually the dad is loving and adjusting and trying to lead the child into a good life. It's an appearance that comes that way. A little bit more about who actually punishes. When an evil and infernal spirit assails anything divine with the intent of hurting it, as when he blasphemes the Lord or the Word, or any good and truth of doctrine, or any good spirit or angel whom the Lord protects, that evil spirit immediately deprives himself of the Lord's protection. For every spirit, the evil as well as the good, is under the Lord's protection. And when that is taken away, he falls into evils and falsities of every kind, which are from hell. At the same time, he falls into the hands of those that are from hell, who are called punishers. And then these punish and torment him according to the evil that has done or attempted to do. From this it can be seen that the Lord does no evil as such, but that the evil spirit himself brings evil upon himself. That is, the evil which is in him does it. And then finally, punishment is mercy. To be punished is of mercy. Why? Because the idea of punishment is it bends all the evil of penalty into good. So that's a concept to think about what's going on in punishment. It's not just revenge. The purpose of punishment here is to amend and direct and to get people to get out of that bad place into a place of self-control. Divine good judges all people to heaven. Very important idea. In the new church, predestination. Every human being is created and predestined for heaven. If you don't get to heaven, it's because you were kicking and screaming and fighting all the way. The Lord wants you in heaven. Reading a thing. Oh, where was I? I saw something. Oh, I was watching this documentary on Mr. Rogers. And trying to figure out what he was. He says, what you wanted to realize, what he wanted to get across with all those years of TV was that it's not just that you're not just you're special in the sense, oh, you're special, everybody's special that way. It's he wanted you to know, he wanted every human being to know that that your heavenly Father thinks you are a marvelous creation and wants the best for you. Every one of you individually, your heavenly Father wants the best for you. That's the core of it all. That's the message here. Divine good, I did that one. So unless the evil were separated from the good, the evil would do harm to the good and would constantly be encouraging to destroy order. Thus, the prevention of the good from suffering harm is an act of mercy. A couple more quickly. I see the time's running away. It's the same in the earthly kingdoms. If evils went unpunished, a whole kingdom would be steeped in evils, and this being so, it would perish. For that reason, judges and kings are showing greater mercy when they punish evils and remove them from society, those who commit them, rather than when they show undue leniency towards the same. Real mercy is the protection of society, the larger human. So you're showing mercy when you take someone out of that and prevent them from harming the innocent. Punishments are merciful. I spoke with spirits who thought that it was contrary to mercy to be punished, but they were told that it is merciful and that it is unmerciful not to be punished, and they were convinced by an example. If a father does not chastise, but rather indulges his wayward and wrongdoing son or daughter, then he is unmerciful, for he then draws him or her towards all manner of evils, and is therefore unmerciful toward his children and toward others. That punishment is not contrary to love, is therefore also obvious. I've been looking for this passage. I think I've derived it for myself, but I sort of summarize it this way. If a parent or a teacher sees a child doing something that is evil, it's out of order, if that person does not act to stop that behavior, what it's showing is that the person loves the evil more than the child. That doesn't mean you shoot them. As my friend Dr. Fisher used to say, it doesn't have to hurt, but it has to happen. A couple quick more about mercy. Charity and mercy are present with him who exercises righteousness and judgment by punishing the evil and rewarding the good. Charity resides within the punishment of the evil, for he who imposes the punishment is moved by a strong desire to correct the one who is punished, at the same time to protect others from the evil evil he may do to them. So again, you're seeing the motives here. It's not revenge. It's not that kind of thing coming out. It's not anger at people. Punishment is done from love, leading from love, and when possible, and when necessary, adjusting the behavior. The fundamental requirement of charity is to act in an upright and just way in everything connected with one's duty or function. For example, if a judge punishes a wrongdoer in accordance with the laws and does so out of zeal, He is moved by charity toward the neighbor, for he desires the reform and so the good of that person, as well as desiring what is good for the community and his country. He punishes him to prevent doing further harm to the community, and so it is able to love him if he is reformed, as a father loves a son whom he chastises, and in so doing loves the community and his country, which in general is his neighbor. So, when it comes to punishment, we need to follow the same principles that are used in the spiritual world. First of all, never punish in the heat of anger, but from the love of correction, which means knowing the difference between anger and zeal. And I'm going to take a moment and give a personal example of how the difference can be illustrated. When I was in grade 7, back in Bernathen Elementary School, my teacher was Louise Stevens. She was her first year as a teacher. And interestingly enough, some years later, I came back and was her boss. I was the assistant principal in Bernathen. She was still the teacher there, which meant I was able to experience an incident in a classroom, and then some years later come back and have her tell the story of her perspective of it to me as her boss, not remembering that I was in the room. It was kind of interesting. So what happened was, I'm sitting there, and a couple of the 7th grade boys were mouthing off. And Louise was a sweet young woman. She was just come out of, it was her first year teaching. And she was just getting agitated to the point where she was nearly in tears. And she actually opened the door and went across the hall, banged on the principal's door, said, "Oh, terrible things are happening." So the principal comes in. David Simmons was the guy. Some of you may know him or heard of him. Rebbe Dave, yeah. His son Jeremy works in Bernathen. Anyhow, so David Simmons comes into the classroom, and I'm sitting there as a student. And he was known to have, when he spoke with a certain amount of enthusiasm, he'd sometimes, a little spittle would fly. Well, he comes in, and he is red in the face, and he gets right in the face of this other kid, and he's just ripping him up one side and down the other, just right in his face. His face is red, and the spit's flying, and the whole thing. And I can testify from being in the room, the rest of us were terrified. We're sitting there, oh no, what's going to happen to us? And then finally he walks out, and we're all sitting there, and Louise comes back in. Okay, jump forward about 20 years. I'm now the assistant principal, and Louise says, there was that day that David Simmons went into that classroom. And she says, he was in there, and he was chewing out that kid, and she says, I was so afraid for the child that I was ready to throw myself bodily on the child to protect him from David's, rage. And she says, and then he walked out of the classroom, and she looked at me, he says, he looked at me and said, that gets harder to do every year. It was all an act. It was zeal. When love flames, when love is seeing a disorder and saying, we want to bring you back into order, we want to restore self-control in your life, sometimes we have to flame. And when Jehovah flames, sometimes the earth opens and people fall in. But it's done from love. Love of bringing people back into order. Getting people to a message to try and say, from the moment you're born to the moment you die on this earth, he's constantly working to direct and correct and to lead you to heaven. Constantly turning, whatever your choices are, he's constantly bumping you in the right direction, no matter how hard you push against it, because you are his beloved children. And he wants you to go to heaven. And that's what he's doing. So that's zeal, love flaming. So never punish in the spirit of revenge or getting even. And the goal of punishment is to break a state of disorder, and the punishment ends when self-control is regained. I think that's a thing we miss in our society, that you don't really need to keep punishing someone once they realize they're in trouble and they've stopped. Every once in a while you hear, somebody's got convicted of some crime and they're saying, well, he only got 7 years. That doesn't seem fair. He should, And I turned to my wife and I said, if you put me in a jail cell, and you put me in the cell and you locked the door, 1 minute would be enough. I would go, I get it. I would be amended. A jail sentence of 1 minute would be quite satisfying for me. It would be quite enough to fix me. But, the idea of 7 years or a life, oh my gosh. But if the person has come back into control, they don't need to be punished. The whole element is the Lord wants you to figure out what's right from the Word and then do it for yourself because you recognize it's good. He says, the young man comes up and says, what should I do? And he says, follow the 10 Commandments. He says, oh, I do that. He says, okay, what more should I do? He says, right. He says, sell what you have, give to the poor, take up your cross and follow me. Sell what you have. Get rid of all your feelings about material wealth. They're not going to save you. Don't fill your barns because you could be called tonight. Give to the poor. Love others. Be kind to each other. That's a core teaching of the church. But the final one is one people don't get. Taking up your cross means not doing it because it's enlightened self-interest. Do it because the Lord asks you to. He's your Heavenly Father. He says, please do this. Okay. You do it because He asks you to. That's how you get ready for heaven. Man is like a miniature society unless he deals with himself in a spiritual manner, as the wicked in society at large are dealt with in a natural manner. After death, he will be corrected and punished until he ceases to do evil for the fear of penalty, although he can never be brought to good from the love of good. The point being, punishment stops when you come into order. All right, last thing, this is it. So it should be thought that the Lord permits anyone, it should not be thought that the Lord permits anyone to be punished, let alone continuously to eternity, except for the sake of correction. For whatever is from the Lord is good, and nothing but purpose, thus for the sake of a good end. So, whatever happens, the Lord is your Heavenly Father is trying to lead you to heaven. Sometimes it's necessary to give you a bump to keep you on the right course. And when we're in the role of being someone who administer the lives of others, we can use these principles ourselves and probably have a better result and a useful result in society. Okay, I'm done. See, I'm done.
We've got to know everything.